Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amit Dogra, a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Study, and it gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to another edition of Wednesday Seminar. I will be the master of ceremony for today's session. The title for today's seminar is Contours of the Youth Crisis in China Today. International media is replete with reports highlighting the struggles faced by China's youth as they grapple with soaring unemployment rates and navigate through a landscape of demotivation and despondency. Interestingly, amidst this challenge, they have continued to uphold their patriotic spirit, pledging allegiance to the Communist Party of China. Recently, Dr. Hemant Adlakha and Ambassador Kishan Rana authored an article for the Indian Express on 7th June 2023, where they explored the variable contours of this issue. This seminar examines the multifaceted dimensions of the issue, the intricate connections between this phenomena and various key elements, such as demographic trends, economic conditions, the urban-rural divide, and prevailing societal trends shall be delved into. The perspectives brought in by the speakers shall shed light on the challenges and aspirations of China's youth and shall contribute to broader discourse on the dynamics shaping our world. Our speakers for today are Dr. Hemant Adlakha and Ambassador Kishan Rana. Dr. Hemant Adlakha is an associate professor at the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is also Vice Chairperson and Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, Delhi. His areas of research include political discourse in the PRC and modern Chinese literature and culture. His articles have appeared in China Report, The Diplomat, Japan Times, Encyclopaedia of Race and Racism. His co-translation of Lu Xun's prose poetry collection from the Chinese into Hindi has been published by the NBT in November 2019. Our second speaker is Ambassador Kishan Rana, who served as the Ambassador and High Commissioner to Algeria, Czechoslovakia, Kenya, Mauritius, and Germany. He is an Emeritus Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and has recently authored a book in 2022 titled Churchill and India, Manipulation or Betrayal. Chairing today's session is Professor Shobri Mitra, a professor of Chinese and chairperson of the Center for Chinese and Southeast Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, and a member of editorial board of China Report. Her teachings and research have spanned the fields of contemporary Chinese literature and criticism, Chinese cultural history, gender issues, India-China cultural relations, and regional interaction. Her latest publication is an edited volume titled China's May 4th Movement, New Narratives and Perspectives. Before I hand over to the chair, let me lay out a few housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to remain muted during the presentation. Questions can be posted in the chat box during the event, or you can use the raise hand option. Also, participants are kindly requested to mention their title and affiliation, along with questions for better identification. After the presentation, you will be called upon to unmute yourself and ask questions. That's all from my side. I now hand over the floor to the chair to take proceedings forward. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you for that very extensive introduction of the speakers and of myself. I'm very happy to be part of this Wednesday seminar today, which are presentations by two of my very favorite China scholars, my friend and colleague, Dr. Hemant Adlakha, and Ambassador Kishan Rana, from whom I've learned a lot over the last several decades. By way of beginning this Wednesday seminar, I would just like to put on the table a few observations which are actually known to all, that youth in any society actually constitute a very, very prominent force of transformation and transition. And China, especially in the 20th century, starting from the May 4th movement, has seen this and proven it in its experience time and again. Even through, not to talk about the fact that the May 4th movement eventually led into the formation of the Communist Party of China, and then eventually the liberation of the Chinese people and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And through the journey of the PRC, even in Mao's China and definitely later, the youth have come up again and again with their brand of concerns and their brand of putting those on the table, starting from the 1989 Tiananmen Square movement, and even later in the recent times, they have found ways and means of putting it for everybody's, for the leadership's consideration and other things. But the point that remains is that the crisis of the youth have been perceived by the youth themselves from time to time over a period of time. From the nature of those crises have been changing. There was a time when the Communist Youth League was actually wondering how to take forward the views or the ideology of the Communist Party of China in the post-reform period, where the concerns of individual initiative was actually breeding more disparity than before. So with all those points in, and even recently, I think the very important fact that the youth have found very innovative ways of protesting through their proposition of what they call involution and other ways of protest. So in this context, we are now going to listen to two very eminent scholars of China studies in India who have been writing on these issues and many other issues for decades now. So we'll begin the Wednesday seminar first with the presentation by Dr. Hemant Adlakha, followed by Ambassador Kishan Rana. So I think it's about 15 minutes each. So over to you, Hemant.
Thank you, Shobhari. I hope I'm audible enough.
Yes.
At the very outset, thank you, ICS, and thank you, Amit. But I must first thank Ambassador Rana, because today's event actually an initiative taken by him. He led me also to our already mentioned joint article on the similar theme, which appeared in the Indian Express in the month of June. So all my thanks to Ambassador Rana for taking the initiative for this webinar and also for the earlier joint article.
Hemant, we can't hear you suddenly.
Okay. Please keep telling me whenever I am not audible, because there is a problem here at my end.
Yeah.
Okay. So given the 15 minutes which I have for presentation, I also would like to make it very clear at the very outset that my short presentation is based on the media reports, both Chinese media and the global media. I have not done any of the critical study or data collection or survey on my own. It's more like a reflection on the available or ongoing or unfolding discourse on this issue. And also my impressions on the basis of what I am gathering from the report and media. So with that, I have a written text prepared so that it will help me keep to the time limit I have been out. And for the convenience of the listeners and for my own discipline, I've structured my written text into 4 sections. I'll come to that one by one. Let me begin with the short introduction of my presentation. Now, strong critiques of China's current regime and the leadership, and we believe that the current CPC regime led by Xi Jinping is increasingly becoming authoritarian. They view China's youth crisis as a part of the social clock ticking away, especially since the Chinese economy has been failing to both recover from the adverse pandemic impact, that is despite the lifting of zero COVID restrictions last December, and also because of the failure of the economy to grow, especially in the last 6 months, as per expectation. So the youth crisis is only a part of or only an aspect of the larger crisis which is in the making. That's what my basic understanding. So some China watchers have even been making claims that situation today in China is a reminder of the economic crisis which led to the massive student protest culminating at the Tiananmen Square students' killing on 3rd and 4th of June 1989 in Beijing. But let us keep for the time being these things aside, these speculations aside, like whether the ongoing youth crisis is the making of another Tiananmen Square movement, etc., etc. Because we still do not know how far China's jobless millions of youth and graduates will go on protesting. And essentially, the crisis, youth crisis, what we are calling, essentially it is the employment crisis, and which has suddenly emerged because of the hundreds and millions of new graduates who have hit the job market last year and this year, and especially white-collar jobs, and they are not able to find these jobs, and therefore this has drawn attention both of the media and the scholars. We also don't know how long China's economy will continue to grow at a slower rate than expected. And we also don't know if the swelling ranks of jobless youth and unemployed college and university graduates would eventually pose the biggest challenge to Xi Jinping's power since he first claimed China's helm more than a decade ago. But what we do certainly know is that, and we see that also, that the continuing crisis or youth crisis undermining Xi Jinping's claim that the CPC authoritarian China model is ethical or more efficient than democracy. And what we are also clearly able to see is the lie the CPC discourse power has been propagating, that the Chinese people overwhelmingly approve the party rule and the Xi Jinping's governance model. So with this brief introduction, I come to the first subsection of my presentation, which is called Youth Joblessness, Facts and Figures. Because of the time limit, I may skip some of the paragraphs, which I'll cover up during question and answer session. So please bear with me. In recent years, hundreds and millions of youths with the tertiary educational qualifications have been facing joblessness or are forced to take up either low-wage employment and are being also pushed into the informal sector of economy. More recently, especially during the past couple of years, hundreds and millions of college and university graduates are either without work, that is mainly white-collar jobs, or are being pushed into low-paid jobs and forced to make a living in the precarious gig economy, as the economists call it. Now, according to the most recent data released by China's National Statistical Bureau, before the Bureau was instructed by the CPC authorities to stop releasing employment or labor-related data in the last month, the urban youth employment for the age group 16 to 24 years was at a record high of 21.3% in China, and it was still rising. In an article published in the month of July, that is last month, in the liberal financial news magazine from Beijing called Caixin, AIXIN, Tang Tan Tan, a professor of economics at Peking University, claimed that not only there was a continuing upward trend, but in reality, the youth unemployment figures would be much higher. Professor Chang Tan Tan calculated that if 16 million non-student youths are staying at home with their parents, are added to these figures, these above figures of 21.3%, then the real youth joblessness rate could be as high as 46.5%. This is the Chinese professor's claim. Now, the online article in this news magazine, Caixin, appeared on July 17, just around the time when the instructions were issued of avoiding publishing such negative news. And within a few days of this publication, the article disappeared from the air. And also Professor Chang Tan also disappeared from the public view. So that's very interesting. I'll come to that, why. So I quickly move on to the second section of my presentation, which I call 2022 and 2023 cohort, billions of unemployed graduates, China's new lost generation. The issue of youth unemployment has become the most hotly debated and widely discussed topic in China, both in the social media and in public polls. Earlier in March this year, just as the annual ritual of 2 sessions was about to conclude, social media was hit by a Kung Ichi literature phenomenon. For more details about this Kung Ichi literature phenomenon, not go into details here because of the time. You may please refer to the article I wrote on this topic, which appeared in the Indian Express on April 21st. Now, according to reports in time, it is estimated that there are 96 million youths aged 16 to 24 years living or residing in the urban area, of which 33 million are jobless. Another 48 million are engaged in education or are studying. And there is no information on the status of remaining 15 million. And these remaining 15 million are being described as professional children or full-time children. I'll explain it in a while. What are these professional children or full-time children? A more revealing data shows that this year, 11.58 million fresh graduates entered the job market in China, which is nearly 1 million more than last year. Last year it was around 10.76. So, as observed by an economic historian, Adam Tooze, who also runs a website called Chartbook, CHARTBOOK. These numbers are truly ominous for those from second and third tier universities, many of whom are first generation college students, whose families have everything riding on their economic success. Now, interestingly, and notwithstanding the instruction from the top authorities to avoid publishing job-related or economy-related negative news, it was a Chinese language semi-private online daily newspaper which, highlighting the plight of millions of unemployed youths, published series of commentaries about their anxieties and damaged emotional lives. The newspaper is called The Paper. In Chinese, it is called Hanghai Xinwen. Hendeai, Hanghai Xinwen. Xinwen is news. XINWEN. Yet another study has shown that a decade ago, an overwhelming majority of urban unemployed youth in China only had high school education or less. In contrast, today, more than 70% of jobless Chinese urbanites aged 16 to 24 years, they have a degree from a higher education institution. And within that category, nearly 42% have earned a post-graduation degree or even a higher degree. Okay, now a total of nearly 20 million graduates belonging to cohort 22 and 23 are believed are believed to be not only the most pampered and who have grown up in prosperity in China, but they are also the most well-educated generation in the history of People's Republic of China. And the sad thing for them is, as George Magnus, who is a well-known China researcher at the University of Oxford's China Center, recently observed and wrote in the Financial Times that describing their plight of these more than 20 million first graduates or first-time graduates who were born in the 21st century, last year and this year. The total is more than 20 million. For their pessimism and joblessness, a new phrase has been coined in Chinese, which is called Pan Lan, and Pan and Lan, Lan, which basically means pessimism or rotting, or let it rot, as we translate. Now, the sister publication of the Chinese newspaper I cited above, the paper, has an English language sister publication. It comes out from Shanghai. That's also semi-private. Called 6 Tone. You know, Mandarin has 5 tones. It's called 6 Tone. That means it gives you an extra dimension. Now, 6 Tone recently observed that for young Chinese, pandemic hasn't just brought years of lockdowns. It has fundamentally altered their expectations for the future and their understanding of their place in society. Speaking of China's Generation Z, or Gen Z, as this first and second cohort are being called, graduated in 22 and 23 respectively, and born in 21st century. That 2022 was the year China's Generation Z came of age. The first cohort of young Chinese born in the 21st century, known as the post-00 generation, that is 2000, have now reached the legal marriage age and graduated from university. After growing up during an age of rapid economic growth, many Generation Z graduates youths arrived at college full of confidence. They took it for granted that they would find good jobs and enjoy a comfortable life after graduation. But life had something else in store for them which they had never imagined. Just like the first cohort in 2022, for the second cohort this year, China's economy continues to face unprecedented slow growth, and almost all white-collar jobs have dried up. In a survey conducted in July this year, only among first and second cohort graduates, nearly 85% respondents said their lives were less fulfilling than they had expected. Over 75% said their sense of security had reduced, while nearly 70% said their confidence in the future has been lower. And this is all data and survey published by the Chinese media. Now, 6 Tone, in fact, carried a 4-part series reflecting on the plight of unemployed Generation Z, and even described most of them as mourning their future, or call them the lost generation. Because my time is running out, I'll skip the next part and jump to the concluding part of my presentation. It's called Widening Social Inequality. Is the social clock clicking? The slowing down of Chinese economy is not just affecting the youth employment, nor are problems in other areas such as falling consumer demand, lower investment, costly education, inaccessible healthcare, especially in the rural areas, ongoing difficulties in the real estate sector, and local government debt, etc. All these are contributing consistently over a period of 10 years earlier also. What I'm saying is that nothing has been done in the past decade under the Xi regime also to address to these issues. And that is where the problem lies. And that is where the questioning of the Xi Jinping model of governance lies. And all these are contributing to the deepening and widening of the social inequality. This in turn has led many experts within China and scholars to say the social time bomb is ticking up. Because, as the argument goes, these are not problems which cropped up overnight. These are not issues which are results of only the pandemic impact. As a recent article in the Bloomberg has noted, the CPC regime and President Xi both are aware more than 20 million idle educated young people are the potential source of social instability. Not at all surprising, therefore, when in last March, that is March this year, the social media Kungichi meme uploaded by an unemployed university graduate invited the wrath of the party and the party organ. I will not go into details because I have already referred to my article for more details on this. Therefore, it is not astonishing that last month the CPC Politburo, while declaring economic recovery so far as tortuous, also ordered the state news agencies and media to announce bad economic news positively. I don't know, this is something of Chinese characteristic. How can it be achieved? I don't know. Does not all this indicate that the regime is really clueless, maybe nervous? Or else, why did Xi Jinping most ridiculously urge young people to eat bitterness? Eat bitterness, triku, the Chinese metaphor, meaning endure hardship and develop grit. As was to be expected, the parties and the Xi's suggestion that educated young people instead should take up rural jobs, elderly care, and babysitting have met with young people's mockery. Now, let me conclude by citing a China expert who has been observing and writing about Chinese economy for long years. And I quote, at present, terms such as lying flat, which became very popular 2 years ago, terms such as lying flat on social media indicate an air of resignation and pessimism. But there are also increasing signs of anger and hostility, marked by ridiculing of official announcements. But a new mood is developing in China, which is not only aware that laws of a market economy, even socialist market economy, never cease to operate. But this mood is also opposed to the official dogma of socialism with Chinese characteristics in the new era. Thank you. Hello, I've just concluded my presentation.
Okay. I took a little time to, I was thinking that you were about to add a few more lines. So after that, I think we'll hand it over to Ambassador Kishan Rana for his presentation. Kishan, are you there?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shaubri. Thank you very much, Hemant. Hemant has given a very detailed and comprehensive view of the youth, the situation among the youth in China right now. Without repeating what he has said, let me offer a slightly more wide-angle view of the scene. First, between 1978 and 2018, China saw a pace of economic growth which no country in the world has demonstrated in history, and least of all, a country of the massive size of China. That is to say, to put it in very clear graphic terms, every 10 years, China's national income doubled between 78 and 2018. It's an incredible rate of growth. That is now history. There is not the slightest possibility that such a pace of growth can be maintained or has been maintained after 2018. So here is a country used to something like 50 years of dramatic growth, which is now, in a sense, grinding to a much slower, normal rate of growth. And this has consequences of the kind that Hemant has described. Second, demography. In 1979, China formally declared a one-child norm for the entire country. But in fact, many years before that, married couples were under pressure from their street committees, from their work committees. And you know, China is a highly organized society. They were under acute pressure not to have more than a child. I was in China from 1970 to 72 on my second assignment, and I have graphic evidence of this in the terms of what we heard from our cook and the scabs that he had on his hands, which he explained with great reluctance, were caused by his wife, who refused to enforce the one-child norm and wanted a second child. And he said, we cannot have a second child, and she would literally attack him with her fingernails. It's a silly, small story, but it's also a true story of the way in which, a human story of the way in which a single child norm was pursued. Now, this is social engineering of a kind that nowhere has been seen in the world in history. And we now see the consequences of this. And a large part of the crisis of today connects with that one-child norm that was enforced rigorously for 50 years, from 1979 till about 2018, 2019. India has not had such a norm, but we have pursued a policy for smaller children and smaller families, 2 children. And that has worked, but in a much gradual, slower fashion. And of course, it is not nearly as draconian as a one-child rule. My third point relates to employment options. As Hemant has graphically explained, there are now insufficient jobs, particularly for the highly trained graduates of the elite institutions. And they have reacted essentially with a kind of passivity, of lying flat, as they call it, or let it rot. That's another term that is in use. All these are essentially personal reactions. And many say that they work for a few months and then they lie back and they say, we don't have to go and work. Part of the reason, and this is the, shall we say, the unanticipated consequences of social reform, social policy. Please remember, if for nearly 40 years, 50 years, a one-child policy has been pursued, it means that across almost 2 generations, families have only had one child. So many young people are today in a situation where they are not only the only child of their parents, but that their parents are also the only children of their own parents, that is, for the young man's grandparents. This means that the money from this stream of 2 generations comes to this single child. And there is therefore no longer a pressure to go and work because they have money, they have resources. Parents will look after them. Grandparents will give them money. This is again an example of the unanticipated consequence of major social reform pursued through draconian compulsory measures as China has done. This is a rich subject for exploration, and I'm sure there will be a great deal of research emerging on this. This in turn has impacted on social attitudes, which Hemant has described, and which I endorse entirely, of course, this attitude of laissez-faire, saying, what do I care? I have enough resources to keep body and soul together. I don't have to work. This kind of despondency, this kind of social giving up on society. Now, what consequence does this have on the wishes of the leadership of the party to push through growth? This again is a rich area for research, very difficult to carry out because that kind of on-ground research is not possible in China anymore. We see this in a different way. We should look at the numbers of Chinese who go abroad to study. Now, mind you, the COVID crisis, the COVID pandemic of 2019 was a game changer. So we have largely to focus on what happened before 2019 and then catch up a little bit of what's happening after, say, 2022, when things have kind of begun to return to normalcy. And we now see that, in fact, the surge for Chinese to go abroad to study had begun to decline in the 2010s. In the early 2010s, there was a kind of passivity about going abroad to study. There was no longer a hunger to go abroad. Every year, China sent out about 700,000 young people to study abroad. That number has declined. It's somewhere in the zone of 500,000 per year now, partly owing to the COVID pandemic, of course. But the priorities have changed. There is no longer a great urge to go to the United States. The two countries that are now at the top priorities for Chinese youth when they decide to go abroad is Australia and the United Kingdom. No longer the United States because of various factors relating to China, relating to Chinese students in the US. I will not get into that, but this can easily be looked up. I compare the situation and the developments in China with what's going on in India, and I will bring India into focus just a little bit later, but let me say here simply that, in fact, the number of Indians going abroad have surged. Currently, about 750,000 people go abroad to study, and the United States is the top priority for them. Now, the other interesting fact to consider is what percentage of them do return. Now, the return process is in many cases gradual because students sometimes stay on for higher studies or stay on to get some job experience. In the case of China, the numbers of returnees was low, somewhere around 30% or so. It has now risen to about 50% or so. That is, more Chinese are now beginning to return home. The number of Indians going abroad, Indian students, men and women, the number is down, and something like 30 to 35% barely return home. So the urge to go to study abroad is linked also with the desire to stay on in these countries. This connects also with migration. And there we see a great urge among Indians, but Indians from certain states, which are the leading states in trying to migrate abroad through legal or undocumented or illegal methods. And the two states which are at the top in this are Punjab and Gujarat, followed fairly closely by Kerala. But people from other parts also go abroad. And this is again a major phenomenon that links with youth employment opportunities. In the case of China, the numbers going abroad to migrate are not easily documented, but now Chinese are beginning to migrate, beginning to go through the undocumented route via not so much Canada as Mexico to get into the United States. So this again is a response of the desire to go abroad to look for opportunities. Now, I will quickly jump to some broad conclusions that I draw from the not very comprehensive study that I have carried out. I think Hemant has been far more methodical, far more detailed in his examination, but I offer impressions based on whatever limited study I have carried out. And I hope that this is a subject that some other young scholars will be attracted to examine further and pursue. Some conclusions. First, there are limits to social engineering. The whole method, the whole policy of a single child in China has now come back, and it has bit the regime authorities in tender regions. I think few countries will so easily attempt that kind of social engineering in the future. Second, there is a situation of despondency, of demoralization among the youth that is particularly striking about China. In the case of India, we also have youth unemployment. We also have young people who are searching for jobs, but they are much more entrepreneurial in what they do as a reaction. For example, the global center of the scamming industry is today India. There are scams that are being perpetuated, internet-based scams, where people are robbed of their bank accounts and their money. And India is the leader in this, an unfortunate consequence. But equally, Indians also produce a large number of the information technology startup companies, the unicorns, the companies that reach $1 billion status. China does very well in this. After the United States is the second largest country with unicorns, and India is the third country and also doing pretty well. What about the Indian economy? What about hopes of growth? Right now, we are in a sweet spot, it would seem. The Indian economy is actually growing at a reasonable clip right now. And that throws up opportunities for young people. But unlike China, there is no attitude of passivity or of despondency that is visible among the Chinese youth. This is a striking contrast between the two countries. People in India will take up very low-paying jobs also in order to earn money. There is a desire to get ahead regardless of consequences. there is no attitude in India, as far as I know, where young people say, I give up, it's not worth it, I give up the struggle. The urge to move forward remains very powerful and very strong. And my last point I offer as a conclusion is that we have done a very bad job in terms of our official policy in skilling of our workforce. The so-called demography dividend is there. There are lots of young people. Today, the dependency ratio, that is the number of working people in relation to the very young or the elderly, like me, is really tilted against both China and India. But in India, there is still an urge to move forward. Our problem is that we have not provided enough skilling to our youth. Fortunately, when the government doesn't do a good job, in India, the private sector steps in, and there are all manner of private sector enterprises, entities that provide skilling opportunities. Maybe not very well, maybe not as professional as they ought to be, but nevertheless, they provide the needed skills. And we see another interesting phenomenon. Over the years, for the last 25, 30 years and more, India has been the largest recipient of foreign remittances from abroad. The Indians who go and work in the Gulf region, North Africa, in other parts of the world, they are sending back money to their families. Over $100 billion comes into India every year by way of remittances. China's remittances from Chinese nationals living abroad who send money home is a much, much lower figure. I forget the exact number, but it is probably not more than 30 or $35 billion. Philippines, Nepal, Pakistan do much better than China, for example. So I will end here. I do hope very much that first, this little experiment that Hemant and I carried out, which is for an academic scholar with the depth of his work and research, and a practitioner like me with limited knowledge, but perhaps a wider sense of coverage, a wider bandwidth, can come together to jointly look at one issue. Hemant and I, we wrote an article which was published in the Indian Express, and this little Wednesday seminar event is a second effort on our part. I hope this inspires other people to engage in this kind of interconnected joint study. And the second point, of course, is that I hope it also encourages people to ensure that their study of China, the examination they carry out, should be related also with what happens in India. They may be scholars of China, but an Indian scholar of China cannot afford to neglect what goes on in her or his own country. Thank you very much for listening to me. I'm deeply grateful to ICS for giving me this opportunity, and I look forward to your comments, your advice, and I hope to be educated with all that you tell me when the discussion is thrown open. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kishan. Thank you so much. And thank you both, Hemant and Kishan, for two very enriching presentations that were both supplementary and complementary with each other. And continuing on my comments that I was making before the presentations began, I just want to add a couple of more sentences to say that, youth crisis very often indicates the crisis, general social crisis of the historical times of any given society. China and India are no exceptions. So perhaps, taking from Kishan's point that some of China's experience, when juxtaposed with the Indian youth's experience, there could be points where there are interconnectedness, or there could be points which we could learn from each other's experience. So having said that, I think I will open the floor open. I mean, declare the floor open. So, Amit, will you help me navigate the questions on the chat box? And other questions, anybody who wants to raise their hand?
Thank you, ma'am. We have some questions in our chat box and also on our YouTube channel. So I think we should begin with the chat box. It's a question from Asif Saeed, and he says, Chinese students went abroad to study to come back to get an opportunity to serve China. Now, considering less job opportunity in China, what is the future of Chinese students?
So is this question directed to both or specifically to one presenter?
No, it's a general question addressed to anyone.
Shall we a couple of more questions, or shall we? I think it is better to take a few more questions. Aren't there any raised hands?
As of now,
no,
but
on the YouTube.
Yes, ma'am. I think the YouTube question shall be clubbed with this one. From YouTube, we have a question from Rahul Pandey, and he cites the Economist magazine and asks that mentioned that 96 million of youth population aged between 16 to 24, only around 6 million are looking for the employment. What's the meaning of this?
I think we can take these two questions together and then come back to another question that is in the chat box, because these two questions relate to employment opportunities and other things. So each of you would like to respond to this, or how should we go about?
Why don't you jump in?
I think the very first question was actually what Rana had mentioned about the.
Hemant, we can't hear you much.
No, I'm saying that the first question was in response to perhaps what Ambassador Rana had said about.
Right.
Okay, if you like, I will try and respond.
Yeah, please.
The questioner says that the Chinese students went abroad for an opportunity to serve China. Actually, I'm not sure if that is entirely correct. Lots and lots of Chinese students who went to China, who went abroad to study in the 80s and 90s, in fact, stayed back in the United States, Canada, and other countries. But yes, there was also a parallel urge that many of them had, which was to come back and work in China, because when they came back, they got a much bigger job and a much better opportunity to work in China. That has changed. My impression is, and Hemant might correct me if I'm wrong on this, my impression is that there is a kind of slight sense of disdain now towards Chinese who go abroad to study. And they are no longer given the juicy, well-paying jobs that they commanded in the past. I missed a part of the second question that was read out by Amit, but I'll stop here and leave it to Hemant to add his own comments. Thank you.
So Amit, would you like to read out that second question one more time before we move forward to, there are two other questions.
Yes, ma'am. So it's basically Rahul Pandey is citing Economist magazine and wants to know that 96 million of youth population aged between 16 to 24 is there, but only around 6 million are looking for the employment. What's the reason behind it? And what's the basic meaning of this?
Hemant, do you want to come in?
Okay. First, please tell me if I am audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, I really don't understand the question very clearly, because it says that, citing the Economist magazine, 96 million youths between the age of 16 and 24, and only 6 million are looking for jobs. Because I also cited similar figures in my presentation, where I said that 96 million youths residing in urban areas, of which 33 million are unemployed, and 48 million are engaged still in their education. And there is no account or no information about the remaining 15 or 16 million youth in the urban areas, who, my explanation based on the Chinese media reports is that 15, 16 million people are being described as professional children, full-time children. In Chinese, they call it Chuan Chi Erni. UAN Chuan and then a Chai Chi, that is job. Erni is basically boys and girls. So, I really don't understand the 6 million people only are looking for jobs. But as I promised earlier that I'll explain what is this full-time children or professional children. These are people who have preferred to actually take up job within their households of doing daily chores and looking after their parents or elderly parents in the family rather than taking up a low-paying job outside. And there are stories, CNN published a long story interviewing one such young woman who had lost her job as a private tutor in a coaching institute 2 years ago because the Chinese authorities had cracked down on the private coaching institute. Many thousands and thousands of people were rendered jobless. So this young woman then finally decided to become, she is now called on her social media blog also as a full-time daughter. This is a new coinage which has come now, full-time daughter, full-time son, and depending on the household incomes of theirs, on average, these urban-based full-time daughter, full-time sons, they are being paid by their elderly parents monthly salary of 3,000 to 4,000 yuan for their subsistence. And of course, this has led to another term because society is not very favorably looking at these full-time children and condescendingly looking at them and describing them as living off their elderly parents' earnings. And there is a new term which has come into Chinese, which is Kenlao, Kenlao. Basically, that roughly translated means doing elderlies. So socially, they are not respected, but this is the only option they have decided to have rather than doing, in the absence of finding a suitable white-collar job, and rather than doing I didn't mention earlier, I skipped one part of my presentation in which I said that compared to past 2 years, this year, the overall number of permits or licenses issued to the taxi drivers in the bigger cities in China has increased 32% in the last 2 years. And in some cities, the city authorities have now put a ceiling. They're not issuing new driving permits or licenses because the number of people taking up these taxi driving jobs is swelling like anything. So this is another aspect of what is happening to the youth. Thank you.
Thanks, Hemant. Amit, do you want to see any more questions in the chat box? That's something
Yes,
I
ma'am.
think.
Yes, ma'am. There is another question addressed to Dr. Hemant. Swam Sid Samal wants to know, sir, could you explain more about the professional children which you said comprise of 15 million in China?
I think I have just answered to that.
Yeah, he's just answered that question. So take up the next question, Amit.
Ma'am, another question is from Aishwarya Acharya, who is a research intern at the ICS. Where does the rural youth of China locate itself in this current crisis? What part has hukou system played in intensifying the crisis? Has government take any steps particularly for the rural youth?
If I may, I would briefly comment on that. Yes, I think the hukou system has been eased a little bit. But in fact, we have not paid much attention to the social engineering dimension of the Hook House system, because that system itself is part of a massive attempt to block movement, natural movement of people and families between rural and urban areas. And of course, it can only be implemented in a totalitarian state like China. It is unthinkable in India or in Africa, for that matter. It would simply not work. Now, that has greatly affected the rural-urban imbalance in China and the rural-urban differences in income levels and everything else. But having said that, we must also acknowledge that the rural areas have also seen massive growth thanks to another parallel policy, which is of encouraging local levels to carry out the monetization of their biggest asset, which is land. And that, of course, has produced also its unfortunate consequences, and the indebtedness of local communities. That again is a rich area for research, and there are scholars who have carried out work on this, including in the ICS fraternity. But it is a fact that the rural youth are not quite in the same dilemma as the urban youth. I don't think there is any lying flat phenomenon that is visible among the rural youth. Hemant might correct me on that. Thank you very much.
So just to add quickly to one or two lines to what Ambassador Rana has said, the rural and urban youths, look at them, especially the unemployment point of view. As I mentioned also in my presentation, that some data has suggested that 10 years ago in China, 7 out of 10 unemployed youths in the age group of 24 years, they were high school pass outs, or they were not graduates. Basically, that meant that they were rural youths. Because it is a problem in the rural areas or smaller or 2, 3, 4 tier cities, where it was difficult to get admission into colleges or universities, etc. So the problem was not drawing any attention. It was not being seen as a potential social clock ticking away. The problem is getting more attention because now it is the large majority of university and college graduates who are suddenly now encountering this situation where they are becoming jobless. In the rural jobless sector or aspect, they were the ones who were actually adding to and were pushed into informal sector, and they were becoming migrant workers. So that problem was going on, and there was no particular attention or focus or planning as part of the policy making being done. That is why, as I had mentioned somewhere else also, that in the last decade, when Xi Jinping came to power, in 2012, and now the number of migrant workers have increased from 272 million in 2012 to 354 million in 2022. These are mainly people comprising of rural youths, rural unemployed youth, who were forced into becoming migrant workers. So that is what I just wanted to say. Thank you.
Hemant, are there any more questions, Amit, in the YouTube channel or in the chat box?
No, ma'am. As of now, we don't have any
No
questions.
further questions. So There are so many young and scholars here.
Still have some time and no more questions are coming forward. I wanted to mention it.
Sorry. Is there
Am I audible?
You are audible, Hemant?
Okay. So I just wanted to say and thank Shobri also that perhaps for today's webinar's topic, there won't be, I mean, there could not have been anyone more appropriate and better than Shobri to be chairing this thing. Because as earlier Ambassador Rana had also mentioned, and you also, Shobri, had mentioned in your opening remarks, the important role and significance of youth as a force in society. And you have just edited the May 4th volume. And as we know, in China, and we have at least two very specific historic movements initiated and perhaps led by Chinese youth, which became epoch-making movement and eventually led to the change in the socio-political system. One was, of course, the May 4th movement in 1919, began with the Peking University student protest. And then, of course, was the Tiananmen Square in 1989, 70 years later. So, and I think Shobri's volume on May 4th, that's a perfect fit. But that also then takes me to make a brief comment on what Ambassador Rana had said earlier, that there is no such visible despondency among Indian youths like in China. So in that context, like I mentioned, two specific youth movements in China in the 20th century. We don't see any such youth movement in India in that sense. I don't know whether how to relate or explain to it. Despondency not being either generalized into a political movement or anyone else who is more capable and able to comment on such dimensions. Please come forward. Thank you.
If I may jump in a bit here, may I? Well, I'm giving myself the permission to jump in a bit here. The two movements that Hemant talked about, one 1919, one 1979, or 89, I'm sorry. So 70 years apart. And in fact, when the 1989 movement was happening in China, I was right there in the Peking University campus where most of the activists were congregating and in the history department in which I was enrolled. So the reason why I talked about this 89 and 1919 is, you know, from 1989, we are already 35 years crossed since then, right? So are we anytime soon in the next 5, 10, 15 years, do we envisage any such youth-led movement that could be transformatory again for China's trajectory? This is actually my official question for the two presenters. And carrying on from what Hemant was saying, it will be interesting to think about what is happening here with our youth. So I, again, go back to the people who are participating. So please, anybody who wants to make a comment.
Professor, we have a raised hand from Madhavi Thampi.
Yes. Madhavi, please, would you please unmute yourself and please ask?
Hello,
Hi.
everybody. I think I'm very glad that this talk was arranged because this is one of the most important subjects, if you ask me, to try and understand what is going on in China. I also wanted to say I agree very much with what Ambassador Rana was saying, that, it's important. I mean, this is really an area where an Indian scholar should bring in the experience or the understanding of the situation in India and, how it compares with China. And we could do a lot of that. In this connection, there are just two questions I would like to sort of raise or throw up a couple of possibilities. One is when you say the lack of, what Hemant just raised about, lack of a movement, youth movement of the same nature or caliber in India as there have been in China, especially the two big ones, 1919 and 1979. I'm wondering what role, political parties' mobilization of youth in India plays in maybe channelizing or dissipating the youth energy, so that it doesn't become a consolidated movement against the system or the establishment or the status quo. So I'm just raising, this is a difference between India and China. I mean, any of us who have taught in universities knows that the role played by political parties in channelizing and mobilizing youth right at the, right from the college and university level, maybe earlier. So this is one question or one point I would like to raise. I'd like to know what the feedback of the speakers is on this. The other thing is about despondency, or the differences in the levels of despondency. To me, it seems related to the level of expectations. I think that in probably this generation of Chinese youth, especially educated youth, who grew up in a time of, phenomenal growth, would have had much higher expectations. And, this sort of letdown, feeling of letdown after everything. They got into college, they got their degrees, and then there's nothing for them. While in India, though, youth unemployment is high, and you just have to see the newspapers every day to know that somebody or the other is talking about that. But, the level of expectation is also maybe not so high. So, people try to do whatever they can do. And maybe the expectation of the government is not so high. What the government can do, people just try to do whatever they can. So these are the two sort of questions I wanted to throw up. And if there's any reaction from the speakers, I would like to hear that.
Thanks, Madhavi. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting questions, and throws up so many other areas of inquiry. Kishan, you want to come in?
Yes, I have just a brief response. I think Madhavi is entirely right, both in raising the questions and the analysis she has given. First, the level of expectations in India has to be different, because we've not seen the kind of growth that China has seen. In fact, India's pace of growth since independence has been absolutely pathetic by any standards. It's only after 1991 that there has been a significant pickup in growth. So our level of expectations is much lower. The other point, it really is part of the system. We don't have a universal solution to our problems. We don't have a single party that dominates the state and in fact is literally the personification of the state, which presumes to say that it knows everything. No political party is anywhere remotely in that situation. Not even the good old Congress party in the earliest days of independence in the 50s was really in that position. So here we see a contrast between the two countries, a profound difference between the two countries. What it does is that it habituates India to a slower pace of growth. Expectations are lesser. And perhaps now, when we see some growth, which is at a level nothing like China's meteoric growth, but still a reasonably good level of growth, is considered to be fairly adequate. That and our resort to external opportunities is much more, shall we say, normal compared with China's. But I've said this earlier, I don't want to repeat myself. I'm sure Hemant would have his comments to add to this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Hemant, please, would you sort of react to Madhavi's, points raised or questions asked?
No, I mean, to Madhavi, of course, it was very refreshing to. I'm not actually capable of giving a thoughtful answer to either your questions and analysis, and also what Rana commented later. But I definitely have to say that one thing I have to say that in India, for example, it's maybe a pathologist or a historian can tell us better. But the interesting thing in India's case is that almost all our post-independence India, our current leaders, right to left, have been actually the products of youth movement, including our current Prime Minister. And the difference perhaps in China's 1919 movement and then later on post-49 1989 movement. One difference is that in India, we don't see youth movement or political movement in which youth participated in large numbers. In post-independent India, it was more of a movement or struggle for change in government rather than change in social system. Whereas in 1919, for example, in China, it was a movement which had a very clear political goal of changing the system. And in India, again, those youth leaders who were product of a struggle, successful struggle in many cases, and then who went on to lead the country. Once they became the leader, and they were the ones who saw to it that youth movements are crushed and not allowed to go further. That's something which puzzles me, and I do not have any definite answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Hemant. I am waiting to hear some more reactions to the discussion here. Patricia, yes, I was hoping you would come in. Please. Patricia, please unmute yourself and come in. Yes. Patricia, can you unmute yourself and come in? Yes. No, you muted yourself. Yes. And now it's fine. Yes.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
I don't think I can be very coherent here. This has been such a thrilling dialogue, and very, very, very interesting presentations. I think it's important the comparative aspect, which is emphasized by Ambassador Rana and by everyone, is something very important. And I think in India, we are privileged because we are seeing both similarities and differences in terms of scale and dimensions and problematics and growth that we can sort of understand and relate perhaps and contrast and so on. But I'm also recalling something that Ambassador Rana used to emphasize a great deal. It's the cutthroat competition that used to prevail, certainly in China, and still here for every opportunity of educational advancement, for admission to school, for final results, for entering colleges and universities and so on. What we are sort of coming to terms with this at present in India, with a lot of cases of much publicized suicides of not only children, but of their parents or uncles or family members, when people don't succeed in getting in. And that seems to be a sort of more active negativity than you see in the lying flat or the let it be and so on. So I'd really like Hemant and Ambassador Rana to come in here. What about the failures? Where is the anguish recorded? And what has happened to that particular train of thinking that used to summarize what we thought about the competitiveness of getting any employment or educational opportunities not so long ago? So I can't be more coherent than that, and that was fairly incoherent, but maybe either of the speakers might like to come back.
Yeah, so would you people like to comment, Kishan and Hemant?
No,
Patricia? Yeah, Hemant.
I go along with Patricia's very pertinent observations. I really not capable of adding anything further to this. Thank you.
Kishan, would you like to respond?
I would.
Yeah.
Look, I have no answer to the question that Patricia raised. It's a very important question. And we can't have a discussion on the attitude of the youth without talking about the failures, the despondency, and the self-harm, including suicides, that take place in the face of failure. This is a cruel fact of a highly competitive society, a highly competitive environment. And we just don't have any easy answer to this. The competitive nature of that society is not going to diminish. If we talk about China, we don't know what happens inside the country in this area. That is how the burden of failure is borne by the young people and by their families. I find it impossible to believe that there too extreme measures of self-harm, suicides don't take place. But they are, of course, not documented because news is controlled. Maybe some of it leaks out in the social media, but maybe it doesn't also leak out so easily. But this is a fact that our politicians, sociologists, scholars, and leaders and people have to consider how to deal with this terrible burden of tight competition. I mean, imagine something like 5+ million sit for the annual UPSC examinations. And let's say that out of the 5 million, a small fraction are really serious candidates. But even that number is surely not less than 200,000 or 300,000. And out of that, barely 700 are appointed to those coveted central government civilian appointments. It's a very, very narrow, tiny funnel through which the enormous numbers that compete for the exams have gone through. I get personal messages from young people who are preparing for their exams, and I'm really at my wit's end to advise them. I tell them that I have no magic mantra, I have no special insight that can really guide them in terms of what they wish to achieve. But I also say, for heaven's sake, always have a plan B and a plan C and a plan D, because don't believe that however good you may be, however hard you may work, the civil service examinations, the numbers that succeed are so tiny that you have to be ready for not succeeding in that endeavor. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Kishan. I think we are almost coming to an end of this Wednesday seminar, if I'm not mistaken. But I would like to, at the end, have any more comments that are coming in. I'm actually very tempted to think of two things here. One, on one hand, we are talking about two different kind of systems, two different kind of historical and political trajectory of these two countries. And we are also talking about despondency on both sides. And I wonder if we are ready to deal with the question whether any of these two systems is better than the other in dealing with those despondency, and how are they channelizing those despondency? What are the methods that the two systems are adopting to address the crisis of the youth? So any more comments or questions? Please tell me, am I right in saying that we are almost near the end of the session today?
Yes, ma'am. We do have a comment from Patricia, ma'am. The burden of failure must be all the more permanent where each generation has only a single child.
Yes. So if, I mean, I'm actually so very excited and enriched by this today's discussion, and so many new questions have been put on the table, and thank you all for making this such a rich experience. Amit, you want to do a formal vote of thanks?
Yes,
but my personal thanks for the presenters and all the participants. Amit, over to you.
Thank you, ma'am. With this, we would wrap the session, and we thank all the panelists for giving us their precious time and all the participants for listening patiently. The video of today's discussion will be available on the ICS YouTube platform. We would like to welcome everyone to a special lecture on 4th September titled Who is In, Who is Out? Urban Redevelopment, Local Identity and Vernacular Proficiency in Shanghai. Information related to the same will be available on the ICS website, or you could also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. And I will just add one more line. As per the mail I received from ICS today, we are hiring for interns. Thank you so much.